Long before modern nations and borders existed, human beings searched for order in the natural world. They watched the movement of the sun, the stars, the changing seasons, and the flow of water across the land. From these quiet observations, the earliest civilizations slowly emerged. Among the most enduring of these early civilizations was ancient Egypt. Situated in northeastern Africa, Egypt developed along the banks of the Nile River, a river that shaped nearly every aspect of Egyptian life. Unlike regions dependent on unpredictable rainfall, the Nile followed a regular and dependable cycle. Each year, its waters rose and fell, depositing fertile soil along the riverbanks. This natural rhythm created stability, and stability allowed civilization to grow. Ancient Egypt was not built overnight. It developed gradually over thousands of years through small decisions made by ordinary people adapting to their environment. Farmers learned where to plant crops. Builders learned which materials would last. Leaders learned how to organize labor and resources. To understand Egypt, we must first understand its land. The Nile River flowed from the heart of Africa northward into the Mediterranean Sea. Along its course, narrow strips of fertile land cut through vast stretches of desert. Beyond the riverbanks lay arid terrain, hostile to large-scale settlement. This contrast created a natural boundary. The desert protected Egypt from invasion, while the river sustained life. As early as 6000 BCE, small farming communities began to appear along the Nile. These early settlers cultivated wheat and barley, raised livestock, and constructed simple homes from mud brick. Life was shaped by the seasons and by the river's predictable floods. Over time, villages expanded. People learned to store surplus grain and trade with neighboring regions. They exchanged goods such as stone, copper, and pottery. The Nile did more than support agriculture. It served as a transportation route, connecting communities across long distances. Boats carried people, materials, and ideas from one settlement to another. Gradually, these scattered communities became increasingly interconnected. As populations grew, social structures began to change. Leadership emerged to manage irrigation systems, food storage, and communal labor. Early rulers were not yet kings in the modern sense, but local authorities who coordinated resources and resolved disputes. Egypt eventually became divided into two major regions. Upper Egypt lay in the south, along the narrow valley of the Nile. Lower Egypt occupied the wide delta where the river met the sea. For centuries, these two regions developed independently. Each formed its own traditions, symbols, and political centers. Around 3100 BCE, this division came to an end. According to later tradition, a ruler known as Narmer unified Upper and Lower Egypt under a single authority. This unification marked the beginning of Egypt's dynastic history. With unity came centralization. A single ruler stood at the head of the state, later known as the pharaoh. The pharaoh was not merely a political leader. He was believed to be a divine figure chosen to maintain harmony between the gods, the land, and the people. This belief lay at the heart of Egyptian civilization. Central to Egyptian thought was the concept of Ma'at. Ma'at represented balance, order, justice, and cosmic harmony. It governed relationships between individuals, the state, and the divine world. The pharaoh's primary duty was to uphold Ma'at. If order was maintained, the Nile would flood properly, crops would grow, and society would prosper.
Religion reinforced this worldview. The Egyptians worshipped a vast pantheon of gods, each associated with natural forces and human concerns. Ra, the sun god, symbolized creation and renewal. Osiris governed the afterlife and resurrection. Isis represented protection and motherhood. Horus embodied kingship and divine authority. These gods were not distant figures. They were woven into daily life through rituals, festivals, and offerings. Temples served as centers of worship, education, and economic activity. Priests maintained rituals believed to sustain the universe itself.
Daily life in ancient Egypt followed predictable patterns. Most Egyptians were farmers who worked the land along the Nile. Their year was divided into seasons based on the river's cycle: flooding, planting, and harvest. When the fields were flooded, farmers turned to other tasks. They repaired tools, worked on construction projects, or assisted in state-sponsored labor. Craftsmen produced pottery, textiles, jewelry, and tools. Artisans worked with stone, wood, and metal to create objects both practical and symbolic. Scribes occupied a respected position in society. They were among the few who could read and write, trained in the use of hieroglyphs and administrative scripts. Writing allowed the state to record taxes, laws, religious texts, and historical events. It preserved knowledge across generations. Education was limited but structured. Young scribes studied for years, memorizing symbols and copying texts. Their skills granted them access to administrative roles within temples and government. The Egyptians believed that life on Earth was only one stage of existence. Death was not an end, but a transition. The afterlife held enormous importance. It was believed to be eternal, while earthly life was temporary. This belief shaped burial practices. Bodies were preserved through mummification. Tombs were filled with food, tools, and texts intended to assist the deceased beyond death. Funerary texts, such as early versions of the pyramid texts, described the journey of the soul and the trials it would face. Judgment in the afterlife was central to Egyptian belief. The heart of the deceased was weighed against the feather of Ma'at. A balanced heart allowed passage into the eternal realm. These ideas reinforced moral behavior during life. To live justly was not only a social duty, but a spiritual necessity. As Egypt's wealth and organization increased, its rulers sought lasting symbols of power and stability. During the period known as the Old Kingdom, monumental architecture reached unprecedented levels. Stone replaced mud brick, and construction techniques advanced significantly. The most iconic achievements of this era were the pyramids. Contrary to popular belief, pyramids were not built by slaves. They were constructed by skilled laborers working in organized teams, supported by the state. These structures served as royal tombs, designed to ensure the pharaoh's successful transition into the afterlife. The pyramids symbolized permanence. They reflected a civilization confident in its order, beliefs, and continuity. By the end of the Old Kingdom, Egypt had become one of the most sophisticated societies in the ancient world. Yet this was only the beginning. Over the centuries that followed, Egypt would experience periods of prosperity and decline, unity and fragmentation, transformation and renewal. To understand how this civilization endured for so long, we must continue deeper into its story.
As the Old Kingdom progressed, the authority of the pharaoh reached its highest point. The pharaoh was seen not only as a ruler, but as the living embodiment of divine order. His role was to ensure stability, prosperity, and harmony throughout the land. To support this centralized authority, Egypt developed a complex administrative system. Officials collected taxes, managed food storage, and organized labor across vast regions. This bureaucracy allowed Egypt to function as a unified state rather than a collection of isolated communities. Large construction projects became possible only through this level of organization. Stone quarries were managed efficiently. Labor forces were rotated seasonally, allowing farmers to work on monuments when the Nile flooded their fields. These projects reinforced loyalty to the state and strengthened Egypt's collective identity.
The construction of pyramids was not merely an architectural achievement. It was a political and religious statement. Each pyramid complex included temples, causeways, and burial chambers. These spaces were carefully designed to reflect cosmic order and the journey of the soul. The Great Pyramid at Giza, built during the reign of Pharaoh Khufu, stands as the most striking example. Its precise alignment and scale demonstrate advanced knowledge of mathematics and engineering. Such monuments required decades of planning and coordination. They also demanded immense resources, which only a strong central authority could provide. Through architecture, the pharaoh demonstrated his ability to command both human labor and divine favor. While monuments dominated the landscape, daily life for most Egyptians remained modest. Families lived in small homes constructed from mud brick. Meals consisted primarily of bread, vegetables, fish, and occasionally meat. Social hierarchy was clearly defined. At the top stood the royal family and high officials. Below them were priests, scribes, craftsmen, and merchants. At the base were farmers and laborers. Despite these divisions, Egyptian society emphasized cooperation rather than conflict. The stability of the land depended on shared responsibility and adherence to Ma'at. Festivals and religious ceremonies provided moments of unity and celebration. Music, dance, and communal gatherings reinforced social bonds. Compared to many ancient societies, women in Egypt enjoyed relatively high status. They could own property, inherit wealth, and initiate legal proceedings. Women served as priestesses, musicians, and administrators within temples. Marriage was considered a partnership rather than a strict hierarchy. Household management played a crucial role in economic stability. This balance contributed to the overall cohesion of Egyptian society. Over time, the centralized power of the pharaoh began to weaken. As resources were strained by massive construction projects, local officials gained greater independence. Provincial governors, known as nomarchs, began to assert control over their regions. Environmental factors also played a role. Periods of reduced Nile flooding led to food shortages and economic stress. Without strong central leadership, Egypt entered a period of fragmentation. This transition marked the end of the Old Kingdom and the beginning of what historians call the First Intermediate Period. The First Intermediate Period was a time of political division and uncertainty. Central authority collapsed, and rival rulers competed for power. Local leaders governed independently, often prioritizing their own interests. Despite this instability, Egyptian culture did not disappear. Art, religion, and daily life continued, though on a smaller scale. This period revealed the resilience of Egyptian society. Even in times of fragmentation, the foundational beliefs and practices endured. Eventually, stability returned. A series of strong rulers from Thebes reunified Egypt, marking the beginning of the Middle Kingdom around 2050 BCE. These pharaohs restored centralized authority while learning from past failures. They strengthened administration, improved irrigation systems, and expanded trade. The Middle Kingdom is often considered a golden age of Egyptian culture. Literature flourished during this period. Stories, poetry, and philosophical texts explored themes of morality, justice, and human experience. This era emphasized balance between royal authority and social responsibility. During the Middle Kingdom, Egypt expanded its influence beyond traditional borders. Military campaigns secured trade routes and protected valuable resources. Fortresses were built along frontiers to deter invasion. Rather than constant conquest, expansion focused on stability and security. Trade networks extended into Nubia, the Levant, and beyond. Gold, ivory, and exotic goods flowed into Egypt, enriching the state. Religious practices evolved alongside political change. The afterlife became accessible not only to kings, but to ordinary people. Funerary texts once reserved for royalty were adapted for wider use. This shift reflected a more inclusive vision of the divine order. Egyptian identity grew stronger through shared beliefs and traditions. As the Middle Kingdom matured, Egypt entered a period of relative peace and prosperity. Strong administration allowed the state to function efficiently. Irrigation systems were maintained, agricultural output increased, and trade routes remained secure. Pharaohs of this era presented themselves not only as divine rulers, but as guardians of the people. Royal inscriptions emphasized justice, responsibility, and moral leadership. This shift reflected lessons learned from the collapse of the Old Kingdom. Stability, Egyptians believed, depended not only on power, but on balance. However, beneath the surface, new challenges were emerging. Egypt's growing trade networks brought increased contact with neighboring regions. Merchants and travelers arrived from the Levant, Nubia, and beyond. These exchanges introduced new ideas, technologies, and peoples. While trade enriched Egypt, it also exposed vulnerabilities. Groups from Western Asia gradually settled in the Nile Delta. Over time, these communities became more numerous and influential. Egypt remained culturally dominant, but political control in the north began to weaken. Around 1650 BCE, centralized authority once again collapsed. This era is known as the Second Intermediate Period. Foreign rulers, later called the Hyksos, gained control of Lower Egypt. They established their capital in the eastern delta. The Hyksos did not erase Egyptian culture. They adopted Egyptian customs, religion, and administrative practices. However, their rule marked a significant shift in power. They introduced new military technologies, including improved weapons and the horse-drawn chariot.
These innovations would later transform Egyptian warfare. Meanwhile, native Egyptian rulers continued to govern Upper Egypt from Thebes. Once again, the land was divided.
Tensions between the Hyksos rulers and Theban kings gradually intensified. Egyptian leaders in the south began to organize resistance. They adapted foreign technologies and trained new armies. A series of military campaigns pushed northward. Step by step, Egyptian forces reclaimed territory. Eventually, the Hyksos were expelled from the delta. This victory marked the beginning of a new era.
Around 1550 BCE, Egypt entered the period known as the New Kingdom. This era would become the most powerful and expansive phase of Egyptian history. The trauma of foreign occupation reshaped Egyptian policy. Security became a priority. Rather than relying solely on natural borders, Egypt pursued active defense beyond its frontiers. A professional military emerged. Standing armies replaced temporary levies. The pharaoh now stood at the head of an empire.
During the New Kingdom, Egypt expanded into Nubia to the south and the Levant to the northeast. These territories provided access to gold, timber, and trade routes. Military campaigns were carefully planned and recorded. Victory inscriptions emphasized order restored through royal authority. War, however, was not constant. Diplomacy played a crucial role. Marriage alliances, treaties, and exchanges of gifts connected Egypt to other great powers of the ancient world. Among the rulers of the New Kingdom, Hatshepsut stands out. She ruled not as a regent, but as a pharaoh in her own right. Hatshepsut emphasized stability, trade, and monumental building. Her reign was marked by prosperity rather than conquest. She commissioned grand temples and sponsored long-distance trade expeditions. To legitimize her authority, Hatshepsut adopted traditional royal imagery, presenting herself in masculine form. Her reign demonstrated the flexibility of Egyptian ideology when supported by effective leadership. After Hatshepsut's reign, Egypt entered a more aggressive phase under Thutmose III. Often described as one of history's earliest great military commanders, Thutmose III led numerous campaigns. He secured Egypt's dominance across the eastern Mediterranean. Victory brought wealth, tribute, and prestige. Yet military success was paired with administration. Conquered regions were governed through local rulers loyal to Egypt. Empire was maintained not only through force, but through organization. As Egypt grew powerful, religious institutions grew alongside it. The cult of Amun, centered at Thebes, gained immense influence. Temples accumulated wealth, land, and political authority. The relationship between pharaoh and priesthood became increasingly complex. Religion remained central to Egyptian identity, but its institutions now held real power. This balance would later be challenged. One of the most unusual rulers of Egypt was Akhenaten. He attempted to transform Egyptian religion by elevating the worship of Aten, the sun disk, above all other gods. Temples to traditional deities were neglected or closed.
a new capital was established at Akhetaten. Art, language, and religious practice changed dramatically during his reign. However, these reforms were deeply unpopular. After Akhenaten's death, traditional beliefs were quickly restored. His experiment revealed the limits of royal authority when it challenged deeply rooted traditions. After this period of upheaval, Egypt returned to tradition under rulers such as Ramesses II. Ramesses II ruled for over 6 decades. His reign was marked by monumental construction, military campaigns, and diplomatic achievements. The famous Battle of Kadesh, fought against the Hittite Empire, ended not in decisive victory, but in one of history's earliest recorded peace treaties. This treaty reflected a changing international landscape where balance of power mattered as much as conquest.
During the height of the New Kingdom, Egyptian culture reached remarkable levels of sophistication. Art, architecture, and literature flourished. Temples such as Karnak and Luxor expanded into vast complexes. Tombs in the Valley of the Kings reflected changing beliefs about the afterlife. Despite wealth and power, the seeds of decline were already present.
Maintaining an empire required enormous resources. Military campaigns, monumental construction, and temple institutions placed heavy demands on the state. As external threats increased and internal divisions grew, Egypt's strength began to wane. Over time, central authority weakened once more. The New Kingdom would eventually give way to periods of fragmentation, foreign influence, and transformation. Yet even as political power declined, Egyptian culture endured. Its ideas, symbols, and beliefs continued to influence the Mediterranean world for centuries. To understand Egypt's final centuries, we must now turn to an era of change, adaptation, and survival.
As the New Kingdom progressed, Egypt faced growing pressures from within and beyond its borders. Foreign invasions became more frequent. Sea peoples attacked coastal regions, disrupting trade and security. At the same time, internal divisions weakened central authority. The power of the priesthood, particularly that of Amun, rivaled that of the pharaoh. Temples controlled vast lands, resources, and labor forces. Royal authority remained visible through monuments and inscriptions, but real power was increasingly fragmented. By the end of the 20th dynasty, Egypt could no longer sustain its empire.
In 1070 BCE, Egypt entered the Third Intermediate Period. This era was marked by political division rather than cultural collapse. The country was split between competing rulers. Pharaohs governed parts of Egypt, while powerful priests controlled others. Libyan dynasties rose to prominence, ruling regions through military strength and local alliances. Despite political instability, daily life continued much as it had before. Religion, language, and artistic traditions remained largely unchanged. Egypt was weaker, but it was not broken.
As Egypt's power declined, foreign influence increased. Assyrians invaded from the northeast, briefly dominating the region. Later, Nubian rulers from Kush took control, presenting themselves as restorers of traditional Egyptian values.
The Kushite pharaohs embraced Egyptian religion and culture. They rebuilt temples and promoted ancient customs. Their rule demonstrated Egypt's ability to absorb and reshape foreign authority within its cultural framework. Following the Kushite era, Egypt entered what historians call the Late Period. This was a time of both revival and vulnerability. Native Egyptian dynasties attempted to restore independence and tradition. Art and architecture consciously imitated earlier styles, especially those of the Old Kingdom. However, external threats continued. Persian forces conquered Egypt in the 6th century BCE. Under Persian rule, Egypt became part of a vast imperial system. The Persians largely respected local customs, but true independence was lost.
In 332 BCE, a new conqueror arrived. Alexander of Macedon entered Egypt without resistance. He was welcomed as a liberator from Persian rule. Alexander adopted Egyptian customs and was recognized as pharaoh. He founded the city of Alexandria, which would become a major center of learning and trade. Though Alexander's stay in Egypt was brief, his impact was profound. After his death, Egypt passed into the hands of one of his generals.
The Ptolemaic dynasty ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. These Greek rulers blended Egyptian and Hellenistic traditions. They governed as pharaohs while maintaining Greek language and customs at court. Alexandria flourished as an intellectual hub. Its library and scholars attracted thinkers from across the ancient world. Egypt remained economically vital, exporting grain and goods throughout the Mediterranean. Yet tension persisted between Greek elites and native Egyptian populations. The last ruler of Ptolemaic Egypt was Cleopatra VII. She was a skilled diplomat and a capable ruler, fluent in multiple languages. Cleopatra sought to preserve Egypt's independence amid Roman expansion. Her alliances with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony were strategic, not merely personal. Ultimately, these efforts failed. In 30 BCE, following defeat by Octavian, later Augustus, Egypt became a province of the Roman Empire. Pharaonic rule came to an end. Under Roman control, Egypt remained an essential source of grain. The administrative systems established over millennia continued to function. Temples remained active, and traditional practices persisted. However, Egypt was no longer an independent political force. Gradually, religious and cultural shifts transformed the region. Christianity spread, and ancient traditions slowly faded. Despite political decline, the legacy of ancient Egypt endured. Its achievements in architecture, writing, medicine, and governance influenced civilizations across the Mediterranean. Greek and Roman scholars studied Egyptian knowledge. Later cultures preserved and reinterpreted its symbols. Even today, Egypt's monuments continue to inspire awe. They stand as reminders of a civilization that valued order, balance, and continuity. Ancient Egypt was not defined by a single ruler or period. It was a civilization shaped by geography, belief, and human adaptation over thousands of years. Through cycles of unity and division, prosperity and decline, Egypt maintained a remarkable cultural identity. Its story is not one of sudden collapse, but of long transformation. And in understanding this story, we gain insight into the foundations of human civilization itself.
Under Roman administration, Egypt occupied a unique position within the empire. Unlike other provinces, Egypt was governed directly by officials appointed by the emperor. This arrangement reflected Egypt's strategic importance, particularly its role as a major grain supplier. The annual shipment of grain from Egypt sustained the population of Rome itself. Control of Egypt meant control of food security. While political authority rested with Rome, many aspects of daily life remained unchanged. Local administrators continued to manage irrigation, taxation, and trade. Traditional religious practices persisted, and temples remained active centers of community life. Yet, beneath this surface continuity, gradual changes were taking place.
As Roman rule continued, Egyptian society became increasingly interconnected with the wider Mediterranean world. Greek and Roman customs blended with ancient Egyptian traditions. Cities such as Alexandria became centers of cultural exchange, philosophy, and science. Languages coexisted. Greek dominated administration and scholarship, while Egyptian dialects remained in daily use. Religious diversity expanded. Traditional Egyptian gods were worshipped alongside Greek and Roman deities. This period was marked not by sudden rupture, but by slow adaptation.
By the first centuries of the Common Era, new religious movements began to spread across Egypt. Christianity gained followers, particularly in urban centers. Over time, Christian communities grew stronger, forming their own institutions and traditions. As Christianity expanded, older religious practices gradually declined. Temples were repurposed or abandoned. This transformation unfolded over centuries rather than decades. Egypt became a center of early Christian thought, monasticism, and theological debate.
By the late 4th century CE, official support for traditional Egyptian religion had largely disappeared. Imperial decrees restricted temple rituals. Public worship of ancient gods faded. Yet cultural memory persisted. Symbols, stories, and artistic traditions continued to influence later generations. The ancient world did not vanish, it transformed. Egypt would later experience new phases of rule and cultural change, including Byzantine and Islamic periods. Each era left its mark on the land, but the foundations laid by ancient Egypt endured. Irrigation systems, settlement patterns, and architectural forms shaped later development. Even when political power shifted, the Nile remained constant. For centuries, much of ancient Egypt's history was forgotten or misunderstood. Monuments stood silent, their inscriptions unread. This changed in the 19th century with the decipherment of hieroglyphs. Scholars began to reconstruct Egypt's past through archaeology, texts, and art. Museums, excavations, and academic research revealed the complexity of Egyptian civilization. Public fascination grew. Ancient Egypt captured the imagination of people around the world. Ancient Egypt remains significant not because of mystery alone, but because of its achievements. It demonstrated how long-term stability could be built through environmental understanding and social organization. It showed the power of belief systems in shaping human behavior. Its administrative practices influenced later states and empires. In many ways, Egypt provided early answers to questions that societies continue to ask today. Ancient Egypt was more than a collection of monuments. It was a living civilization shaped by people adapting to their world. Through continuity and change, it endured for thousands of years. Its story reminds us that history is not defined only by conquest or collapse, but by persistence. And in listening to this long journey, we come closer to understanding humanity itself. Even after the pharaonic rule of Egypt, Egypt never disappeared from historical memory. Greek and Roman writers viewed Egypt as a land of ancient wisdom. Philosophers, historians, and travelers recorded accounts of Egyptian customs, temples, and beliefs. To the ancient Mediterranean world, Egypt represented antiquity itself. Its monuments were already ancient when Rome was young. This reputation ensured that Egyptian ideas continued to circulate long after political independence was lost. Egyptian knowledge influenced many fields. In medicine, Egyptian practitioners developed treatments based on observation and experience. Medical texts recorded diagnoses, procedures, and remedies. In mathematics, practical geometry supported architecture, surveying, and taxation. Astronomical observations shaped calendars and ritual life. These forms of knowledge were not abstract theories. They were tools designed to maintain order in daily life. Later civilizations adopted and adapted these practices, often without knowing their original sources. Egyptian art followed strict conventions. Figures were portrayed according to symbolic rules rather than visual realism. This style emphasized clarity, balance, and permanence. Art was not created for decoration alone. It served religious, political, and social purposes. Images reinforced cosmic order. They communicated ideals of harmony and continuity. Through art, Egypt expressed its worldview across generations. Writing was central to Egyptian civilization. Hieroglyphs combined visual symbolism with phonetic elements. They were used for religious texts, royal inscriptions, and monumental art. Administrative scripts allowed efficient governance. Writing preserved memory. It linked the present with the past. Even when hieroglyphs fell out of use, their presence endured in stone and papyrus. One of Egypt's most remarkable features was its cultural continuity. Despite invasions, dynastic changes, and foreign rule, core beliefs remained stable. The concept of Ma'at endured. The Nile continued to shape life. Rituals adapted rather than disappeared.
This continuity distinguished Egypt from many other ancient civilizations. It demonstrated that survival did not require constant innovation, but careful preservation.
Egyptian identity was deeply connected to place. The land, the river, and the cycle of seasons formed a shared experience. Even under foreign rulers, Egyptians maintained a sense of cultural distinction. This identity allowed Egypt to absorb outside influence without losing itself entirely.
Modern understanding of ancient Egypt is shaped by archaeology. Excavations revealed cities, tombs, and everyday objects. These discoveries challenged earlier myths and romanticized views. Scholars reconstructed timelines, social structures, and belief systems. Each generation refined interpretation. Ancient Egypt became not a mystery, but a subject of serious study.
Despite academic clarity, fascination remains. Pyramids, mummies, and hieroglyphs continued to capture public imagination. This interest reflects a deeper human curiosity about longevity and meaning. Egypt represents a civilization that endured beyond the lifespan of nations. Ancient Egypt cannot be reduced to monuments or rulers alone. It was a society built on cooperation, belief, and adaptation. Its history spans thousands of years, not as a single narrative, but as a series of continuities. By studying Egypt, we study how civilizations persist, and through that study, we better understand our own place in history. When viewed at its full span, ancient Egypt represents one of the longest continuous civilizations in human history. From early farming communities along the Nile to a Roman province within a global empire, Egypt evolved without losing its cultural core. Few societies maintained identity over such an extended period. This endurance was not accidental. It was the result of geography, belief, and social organization working together over time. The Nile shaped Egyptian life more deeply than any ruler or dynasty. Its regular flooding created predictable agricultural cycles. Its narrow valley unified communities rather than dividing them. The surrounding deserts acted as natural barriers, limiting large-scale invasion for much of Egypt's history. Geography provided security. Security allowed continuity. This relationship between land and society became a defining feature of Egyptian civilization. Unlike many ancient empires, Egypt did not rely solely on conquest to maintain influence. For long periods, stability mattered more than expansion. Administration, ritual, and shared belief created cohesion. Even during eras of imperial power, Egypt often preferred diplomacy, marriage alliances, and trade. This approach reduced internal disruption and reinforced long-term order. Religion in ancient Egypt functioned as a unifying force. Shared rituals connected individuals to the state and to the cosmos. The idea of Ma'at shaped ethical behavior, governance, and justice. Belief was not imposed through fear alone. It was embedded in daily life, language, and custom. Through belief, society maintained continuity across generations.
Egypt's survival depended on adaptation. Foreign rulers did not erase Egyptian identity. They were absorbed into it. Libyan, Nubian, Persian, Greek, and Roman rulers all adopted Egyptian titles, rituals, and symbols. This flexibility allowed Egypt to persist culturally, even when political control shifted. Adaptation proved more effective than resistance. While monuments dominate modern perception, most Egyptians lived ordinary lives. They farmed, traded, raised families, and honored the gods. History unfolded not only through kings and battles, but through daily routines repeated across centuries. This continuity of everyday life anchored Egyptian civilization. Despite its endurance, Egypt was not immune to decline. Environmental changes, economic strain, and political fragmentation challenged stability. Central authority weakened when resources were stretched too thin. These pressures remind us that no civilization, however strong, is permanent. Yet, decline in Egypt was gradual, not catastrophic. Ancient Egypt did not vanish abruptly. Its institutions transformed. Temples became churches. Cities adapted to new rulers. Language evolved. The civilization changed form rather than disappearing. This gradual transformation distinguishes Egypt from societies that collapsed suddenly. The story of ancient Egypt offers insights beyond archaeology. It demonstrates the importance of environmental understanding, social cohesion, and adaptability. It shows how belief systems can stabilize societies or challenge them. It reveals that longevity often depends on balance rather than dominance. Ancient Egypt endures because it addressed fundamental human concerns: how to live in harmony with nature, how to organize society, how to find meaning beyond a single lifetime. These questions remain relevant. Through the long history of Egypt, we see reflections of ourselves. Ancient Egypt was not defined by a single moment. It was shaped by countless decisions made over thousands of years. Its legacy lies not only in stone monuments, but in ideas that crossed time and cultures. By tracing this long arc, we gain perspective on civilization itself. History, like the Nile, flows continuously, shaped by forces both visible and unseen. When compared to other ancient civilizations, Egypt followed a distinct path. Mesopotamian societies rose and fell rapidly, shaped by unpredictable rivers and frequent conflict. In contrast, Egypt's environment favored continuity. The Nile's stability reduced competition over resources. This allowed cooperation to replace constant warfare within the state. As a result, Egypt invested more in preservation than in reinvention. This difference shaped Egypt's political culture and long-term outlook. Egyptian society relied heavily on trust in institutions. The state managed irrigation, food distribution, and labor. In return, people accepted authority as a source of stability. This social contract functioned effectively for centuries. When trust weakened during periods of famine or political division, central authority declined. Thus, Egypt's strength depended not only on power,
but on public confidence. Egyptian technology was pragmatic rather than revolutionary. Tools, techniques, and materials evolved slowly. Innovation focused on reliability rather than novelty. This approach minimized disruption and ensured consistency across generations. In architecture, medicine, and agriculture, proven methods were favored over experimentation. Such conservatism reinforced stability. Although Egypt lacked a formal legal code like later societies, law was deeply embedded in custom. Judgment was guided by ma'at rather than written statutes. Officials were expected to act fairly and avoid corruption. Legal decisions emphasized restoration of balance rather than punishment alone. This flexible system adapted to changing circumstances while preserving core values. Education in Egypt was practical and selective. Scribes trained through repetition, memorization, and discipline. Knowledge was transmitted within families and institutions. This ensured continuity, but limited rapid change. The goal was preservation rather than expansion of knowledge.
Egyptian society allowed limited mobility. Talent, education, and loyalty could elevate individuals within administrative structures. However, hierarchy remained central. Social order reinforced stability. Roles were inherited more often than earned. This balance between flexibility and structure sustained the system. Egyptian perception of time differed from modern linear views. Time was cyclical, linked to the Nile's floods and religious rituals. History was seen as repetition rather than progression. This worldview encouraged preservation of tradition. Change was accepted only when framed as restoration.
Rulers gained legitimacy by linking themselves to the past. They restored old temples, revived ancient titles, and referenced legendary ancestors. Memory was political capital. By aligning with history, rulers justified authority. This strategy strengthened continuity across dynasties. Egypt's decline was not sudden failure. It was gradual adaptation to changing global contexts. As trade routes shifted and empires expanded, Egypt became integrated into larger systems. Loss of independence did not mean cultural disappearance. Egypt became part of broader histories. Egypt's greatest strength was its ability to absorb change. Rather than resisting external influence, it incorporated it. This approach preserved identity while allowing survival. Few civilizations managed this balance so effectively. Ancient Egypt stands as a case study in endurance. It shows how societies can persist through stability, belief, and adaptation. Its story challenges assumptions about progress and power. Longevity, Egypt teaches, is achieved through balance. When modern audiences think of ancient Egypt, attention often turns to pyramids, temples, and royal tombs. Yet these structures were only a small part of Egyptian life. Most Egyptians never entered a pyramid or spoke to a pharaoh. Their lives unfolded in villages along the Nile, shaped by routine, labor, and family.
Understanding Egypt means understanding these ordinary lives. The Egyptian calendar revolved around the Nile. Each year was divided into 3 seasons: the flood, the planting, and the harvest. During the flood season, fields disappeared beneath water. Farming paused. Families repaired homes, crafted tools, and worked on communal projects. When the waters receded, planting began. Seeds were pressed into fertile soil left behind by the flood. Harvest followed months later, bringing food security and celebration. This rhythm provided predictability rarely found in the ancient world.
The household formed the core of Egyptian society. Families lived together in small homes, often shared by multiple generations. Marriage was common and relatively informal. Affection and partnership were valued. Children learned by observing adults, skills passed from parent to child. Community life emphasized cooperation. Shared labor strengthened social bonds. Village identity mattered as much as loyalty to the state. Labor in Egypt was diverse. Farmers worked the land. Fishermen relied on the river. Artisans shaped stone, wood, and metal. Craftsmanship was respected. Artists and builders followed traditional forms, ensuring consistency rather than novelty. Their work reinforced shared values. Even objects of daily use carried symbolic meaning.
Diet in ancient Egypt was simple but sufficient. Bread and beer formed dietary staples. Vegetables, fish, and fruit supplemented meals. Clothing reflected climate and practicality. Light linen garments were common. Jewelry served both decorative and protective functions. Comfort mattered, but excess was limited. Life emphasized balance rather than luxury.
Egyptian medicine combined observation with belief. Practitioners treated injuries, infections, and chronic conditions. Medical texts described symptoms and treatments. Healing involved both practical remedies and spiritual rituals. This integrated approach reflected Egyptian worldview. Health was a matter of balance between body, mind, and cosmos.
Old age was respected. Elders held authority within families and communities. Death was approached with preparation rather than fear. Burial practices reflected social status, but belief in the afterlife was universal. Even modest graves included offerings and prayers. Continuity extended beyond life itself. Egyptians valued stability above all. Change was not celebrated for its own sake. Tradition provided reassurance. Rituals repeated across generations reinforced identity. This conservatism allowed Egypt to endure when other societies fractured. Much of Egyptian history unfolded quietly. No dramatic revolutions marked most transitions. Life continued through adaptation rather than upheaval. This quiet persistence is part of Egypt's legacy. Ancient Egypt was not defined solely by power or monuments. It was defined by people, responding thoughtfully to their environment. Their choices accumulated over centuries. Through patience and balance, they built a civilization that lasted. As we move forward, Egypt's story shifts from dominance to endurance, from empire to memory. Yet at every stage, the human experience remains central. The past continues to speak, not loudly, but persistently. For the people of ancient Egypt, history was not something distant or abstract. The past lived alongside the present. Ancestors were remembered through rituals, offerings, and stories. Names were preserved in inscriptions, believed to grant continued existence. To be remembered was to endure. This belief shaped how Egyptians recorded events and honored their dead. Memory itself became a form of survival. Egyptian understanding of time differed from modern perspectives. Time was cyclical, not linear. The rising and falling of the Nile, the movement of the sun, and the repetition of rituals reinforced this view. History was not expected to progress endlessly forward. It was meant to renew itself. This outlook encouraged preservation over innovation. Change was acceptable only when it restored balance. Ritual infused everyday life. Small acts, lighting a lamp, offering food, speaking prayers, carried symbolic weight. These gestures connected individuals to larger cosmic forces. Religion was not separate from life. It was life. Through ritual, ordinary actions became meaningful. Language shaped thought. Hieroglyphs combined image and sound, blending art with communication. Writing was sacred. Words carved in stone were believed to hold power beyond speech. This reverence for language reinforced continuity. Texts were copied carefully, preserving form as well as content. Egyptian culture valued stillness. Calm was associated with order. Excessive emotion or disruption was viewed as dangerous. This preference influenced art, architecture, and social behavior. Even in times of crisis, outward calm was maintained. Silence became a form of strength. Egypt did not seek to dominate history's narrative. Its influence spread quietly through ideas, symbols, and practices. Later civilizations borrowed without conquest. Egypt's legacy traveled through learning rather than force. This subtle endurance distinguishes it from many empires. Throughout political change, the land endured. The Nile continued its cycle. Fields were planted, harvested, and replanted. The river connected generations. Empires rose and fell, but the land remained. Ancient Egypt teaches that history does not always move through dramatic events. Sometimes it flows steadily, shaped by routine and repetition. This continuity created resilience. When change came, it was absorbed rather than resisted. There was no single moment when ancient Egypt ended. Its institutions faded gradually. Beliefs transformed. Language evolved. Yet echoes remained. Egypt did not disappear. It became part of what followed. There was no single moment when ancient Egypt ended. Its institutions faded gradually. Beliefs transformed. Language evolved. Yet echoes remained. Egypt did not disappear. It became part of what followed. What remains of ancient Egypt is not only stone and inscription. It is a model of how societies can persist through balance. It reminds us that longevity is achieved through adaptation, restraint, and memory. Ancient Egypt stands as a testament to the power of continuity. Across millennia, it answered fundamental human questions with patience rather than force. Its story is not loud, it is enduring. And in listening to that endurance, we hear the deeper rhythm of history itself. In ancient Egypt, governance was understood as stewardship rather than domination. Rulers were expected to preserve balance, not impose constant change. Authority carried responsibility to the land, the gods, and the people. This expectation limited excess. When rulers failed to maintain order, legitimacy weakened. Thus, power depended on performance as much as inheritance. While individual pharaohs left their mark, Egypt's strength lay in its institutions. Administration, religion, and tradition outlasted any single ruler. This institutional continuity allowed recovery after periods of instability. Civilization did not rely on exceptional leaders alone. It relied on shared systems. Egyptian society placed humanity within a larger cosmic framework. People were not separate from nature or the divine. They were participants in a universal order. This perspective encouraged humility. Human ambition was tempered by respect for balance. When change became necessary, it was introduced gradually. Reforms were framed as restorations of earlier ideals. Innovation succeeded only when it aligned with tradition. This cautious approach minimized social upheaval. Egypt's rulers possessed immense authority, yet restraint was valued. Public displays of chaos or cruelty undermined legitimacy. Even warfare was justified as restoration of order. Power without restraint threatened Ma'at. Monuments, rituals, and texts connected the present to the past. By honoring ancestors, Egyptians legitimized current authority. Memory functioned as a stabilizing force. Most Egyptians did not experience history as change. Life remained consistent across generations. This continuity provided security. While elites debated policy and theology, villagers tended fields. History unfolded quietly. Egypt's model was not without limits. Resistance to change sometimes delayed necessary adaptation. When external pressures intensified, gradualism became a weakness. Longevity required balance between preservation and response. Patience defined Egyptian civilization. Time was measured in generations, not years. Decisions favored endurance over immediacy. This patience allowed survival through adversity. The Egyptian experience offers lessons beyond antiquity. It illustrates how societies sustain themselves. Stability arises from shared belief, institutional strength, and measured change.
longevity is rarely accidental.
Even today, Egypt's approach resonates. In a world defined by rapid change, Egypt reminds us of the value of continuity. Its history invites reflection rather than spectacle. Ancient Egypt was not a civilization of sudden triumphs or dramatic endings. It was a civilization of steady presence. Its influence persists not through conquest, but through example. In understanding Egypt, we understand endurance.
Ancient Egyptian society was built on the idea that stability was more valuable than speed or expansion. Change was not pursued for novelty, but only when it preserved balance. This approach shaped how Egyptians viewed leadership, tradition, and time itself. Rulers were expected to act as caretakers rather than innovators. Their duty was to protect the land, uphold justice, and maintain harmony between human life and the divine order. When authority aligned with these expectations, society functioned smoothly. This emphasis on balance explains why Egyptian institutions changed slowly. Customs were preserved, rituals repeated, and systems maintained across generations. Through patience and continuity, Egypt sustained itself longer than almost any other ancient civilization.
Ancient Egyptian governance relied heavily on continuity rather than reform. Institutions were designed to function the same way across generations, reinforcing a sense of permanence. Officials followed established procedures, and authority was expressed through tradition instead of innovation. This system reduced instability. People knew what to expect from leadership, law, and religious practice. Even when rulers changed, daily administration remained familiar. Such predictability strengthened trust between society and the state. It also limited internal conflict, allowing Egypt to survive periods that might have destroyed less stable civilizations. Religion in ancient Egypt reinforced social order by connecting human life to cosmic balance. Every action, work, ritual, governance, was believed to influence universal harmony. This belief encouraged personal responsibility. Individuals were expected to live according to ma'at, maintaining fairness and restraint. Because morality was tied to cosmic order, social behavior became self-regulated. Fear of imbalance discouraged excess and chaos. Religion was therefore not separate from governance. It functioned as a stabilizing force that aligned personal conduct with collective survival. Economic life in Egypt depended on cooperation rather than competition. Agriculture required shared labor, especially during planting and harvest seasons. Surplus grain was stored and redistributed during shortages. This system reduced famine and reinforced loyalty to the state. Trade expanded gradually, connecting Egypt to surrounding regions. However, self-sufficiency remained a priority. By emphasizing cooperation over profit, Egypt minimized inequality and maintained long-term stability. Economic moderation supported social cohesion. Education in ancient Egypt focused on preservation rather than discovery. Knowledge was passed carefully from teacher to student, often within families. Scribes memorized texts and copied established works. Original thinking was less valued than accuracy and continuity. This approach limited rapid change but ensured consistency. Information remained reliable across generations. Through disciplined education, Egypt protected its intellectual foundations. Stability was maintained through careful transmission rather than expansion of ideas.
Art and architecture followed strict symbolic rules. Figures were depicted according to meaning rather than perspective. This consistency reinforced shared understanding. Images communicated order, hierarchy, and continuity. Artists did not seek personal expression. They served cultural memory. Through repetition, visual language remained unchanged for centuries. Art became a tool of preservation, reinforcing identity even during political transitions.
Military power in Egypt was traditionally defensive. Protection of borders mattered more than conquest. When expansion occurred, it was framed as restoring order rather than domination. Campaigns were justified through religion and balance. This restrained approach reduced constant warfare. Resources were preserved for internal development. By limiting aggression, Egypt avoided cycles of destruction that weakened other ancient states.
Ancient Egypt's greatest achievement was endurance. Its systems absorbed change instead of resisting it. Foreign rulers adopted Egyptian customs. Institutions adapted without collapse. This flexibility allowed cultural survival beyond political independence. Egypt continued influencing the world long after losing power. Longevity was not achieved through force, but through balance, patience, and adaptation. Ancient Egypt's social structure was carefully layered, yet remarkably stable. At the top stood the pharaoh, followed by priests and administrators, then craftsmen, farmers, and laborers. This hierarchy was not viewed as oppressive, but as a reflection of natural order. Each role carried responsibility rather than privilege alone. Farmers sustained the land, craftsmen preserved skills, and officials ensured fairness and distribution. The belief in Ma'at reinforced acceptance of one's place in society. Because social roles were clearly defined, conflict was limited. People understood how their labor contributed to collective survival. This clarity reduced tension and strengthened unity across generations. The priesthood played a central role in Egyptian civilization. Temples were not only religious centers, but also economic and administrative institutions. Priests managed land, stored grain, and oversaw workshops. Their rituals were believed to sustain cosmic balance and ensure the Nile's renewal. This authority gave temples immense influence. Over time, religious institutions accumulated wealth comparable to the state itself. While this strengthened stability, it also created tension. When priestly power rivaled royal authority, balance weakened. Egypt's history reflects repeated efforts to manage this delicate relationship. Trade connected Egypt to a wider world without eroding its identity. Goods moved along the Nile and beyond Egypt's borders into Africa and the eastern Mediterranean. Egypt exported grain, linen, and crafted goods. In return, It imported timber, metals, and luxury items. Trade expanded knowledge while reinforcing self-sufficiency. Egypt never became dependent on foreign supply. This controlled openness allowed Egypt to benefit from exchange without losing stability. Interaction strengthened the state rather than destabilizing it. Technology in ancient Egypt evolved slowly but effectively. Tools were refined over centuries, not replaced suddenly. Irrigation systems improved incrementally. Construction techniques became more precise with experience. Rather than chasing innovation, Egyptians valued reliability. A method proven to work was preserved. This conservatism limited disruption. While other societies collapsed under rapid change, Egypt endured through consistency. Progress was measured not by speed, but by sustainability across generations. Law in ancient Egypt was guided by moral principle rather than rigid codes. Judgment aimed to restore harmony instead of impose punishment. Officials were expected to act fairly and avoid corruption. Abuse of power was seen as a threat to cosmic balance. Legal decisions reflected context rather than strict precedent. This flexibility allowed adaptation without chaos. Justice was therefore both social and spiritual. By aligning law with Maat, Egypt reinforced trust in authority and minimized rebellion. Foreign rule tested Egyptian resilience. Libyan, Nubian, Persian, Greek, and Roman rulers governed Egypt at different times. Yet each adopted Egyptian customs to legitimize authority. They used traditional titles, rituals, and symbols. Egyptian culture absorbed foreign power without dissolving. Language, belief, and identity endured beneath political change. This capacity for absorption prevented cultural collapse. Egypt survived not through resistance alone, but through adaptation and continuity. Religion evolved gradually in response to social change. Access to the afterlife expanded beyond royalty. Texts once reserved for pharaohs became available to ordinary people. This democratization strengthened belief rather than weakening it. Religion adapted to social reality while preserving tradition. This flexibility ensured relevance across centuries. Spiritual continuity reinforced social cohesion. Even as institutions changed, belief systems maintained stability and meaning. Ancient Egypt's decline was a process, not an event. Environmental strain, economic pressure, and external threats accumulated slowly. Central authority weakened when balance failed. Yet society continued functioning at local levels. Egypt transformed rather than collapsed. Its institutions were reshaped under new rulers. This gradual transition preserved cultural memory. Egypt's legacy endured long after political power faded, influencing civilizations far beyond its borders. Ancient Egypt's strength did not lie in constant innovation or expansion, but in its ability to sustain order across generations. While other civilizations rose rapidly and collapsed just as quickly, Egypt developed a system designed for longevity rather than speed.
This approach shaped every aspect of Egyptian life, from governance and religion to economy and culture. Central authority was built around predictability. The state functioned as a caretaker of balance rather than an engine of change. Officials followed established procedures, and reforms were rare. When change did occur, it was presented as a return to earlier ideals rather than a departure from tradition. This framing preserved social trust and minimized resistance.
The pharaoh stood at the symbolic center of this system. As a divine intermediary, he was responsible for maintaining harmony between the gods, the land, and the people. However, his power was not unlimited. A ruler who failed to ensure prosperity or justice risked losing legitimacy. In this way, authority was bound to performance as much as lineage. Institutions played a more enduring role than individuals. Administrative offices, temple systems, and local governance structures remained largely unchanged for centuries. This continuity allowed Egypt to recover from periods of crisis. Even when dynasties collapsed, the underlying framework of society persisted. Economic organization reinforced stability. Agriculture remained the foundation of Egyptian life, dependent on the Nile's predictable cycle. The state managed irrigation and storage, redistributing surplus grain during times of scarcity. This system reduced famine and prevented extreme inequality. Economic moderation became a defining feature of Egyptian society. Trade expanded cautiously. Egypt engaged with neighboring regions, exchanging goods and ideas without becoming dependent on foreign supply. This controlled openness allowed cultural exchange while preserving self-sufficiency. External contact strengthened Egypt rather than destabilizing it. Religion reinforced this balance. Belief in Ma'at shaped moral behavior, governance, and law. Justice was measured by restoration of harmony rather than punishment alone. Individuals were encouraged to act responsibly, knowing their actions affected both society and the cosmic order. This integration of belief and governance created self-regulation. Social norms were internalized rather than imposed through force. As a result, Egypt avoided the cycles of rebellion and repression common elsewhere in the ancient world. Yet this system had limits. Resistance to rapid change sometimes delayed necessary adaptation. When external pressures intensified, gradualism became a vulnerability. Still, Egypt's emphasis on continuity allowed it to endure far longer than most civilizations. Foreign rule tested Egypt's resilience repeatedly, yet each time the civilization demonstrated its ability to absorb change without losing identity. Libyan, Nubian, Persian, Greek, and Roman rulers governed Egypt across different eras. Rather than erasing Egyptian culture, these rulers adopted its symbols, rituals, and administrative practices to legitimize their authority. This pattern reveals a fundamental truth about Egyptian civilization. Survival depended more on cultural strength than political independence. Language, belief systems, and social structures persisted beneath shifting regimes. Egypt became a civilization that outlived its rulers. The priesthood played a central role in maintaining continuity. Temples functioned as religious, economic, and administrative centers. Priests managed land, stored resources, and preserved ritual practice. Their influence ensured cultural stability,
though it occasionally challenged royal authority. Religion itself evolved slowly. Access to the afterlife expanded beyond the royal family, reflecting social change without undermining tradition. Texts once reserved for kings became available to common people. This inclusivity strengthened belief rather than weakening it. Art and architecture reinforced shared identity. Symbolic conventions remained consistent across centuries. Figures were depicted according to meaning rather than realism. This repetition communicated order and permanence. Artists served memory rather than personal expression. Daily life reflected the same values. Families lived modestly, emphasizing cooperation and routine. Work was structured around seasonal cycles. Community bonds mattered as much as loyalty to the state. These everyday patterns anchored Egyptian society through political upheaval. Decline, when it came, was gradual. Environmental strain, economic pressure, and external threats accumulated slowly. Central authority weakened, but local life continued. Egypt transformed rather than collapsed. Even under Roman rule, Egyptian institutions adapted. Temples remained active, administrative systems endured, and cultural memory persisted. Over time, religious change reshaped society, but the past was never fully erased. Ancient Egypt's legacy lies in endurance. It demonstrated how civilizations can persist through balance, adaptation, and restraint. Its story challenges the idea that power alone ensures survival. Longevity, Egypt teaches, emerges from harmony between people, institutions, and the environment.
Ancient Egypt's endurance depended less on individual rulers and more on the strength of its institutions. While pharaohs came and went, administrative systems, religious practices, and social customs remained remarkably consistent. This continuity created a stable framework that could absorb crisis without collapsing. The bureaucracy played a crucial role in this system. Officials were trained to follow established procedures rather than personal judgment. Records were maintained carefully, ensuring continuity across generations. Taxes, food storage, and labor organization followed predictable patterns. This predictability reduced uncertainty and fostered trust. Temples functioned as institutional anchors. Beyond religious duties, they managed land, employed workers, and distributed resources. Priests preserved rituals and texts that reinforced shared values. Their influence ensured cultural continuity even during political instability. Local governance further strengthened resilience. Village leaders handled daily administration, resolving disputes and coordinating labor. This decentralization allowed society to function even when central authority weakened. Egypt's strength lay in layered governance rather than rigid centralization. Education reinforced institutional memory. Scribes were trained to copy texts accurately, preserving language and knowledge. Innovation was secondary to accuracy. This approach ensured reliability across centuries. Through institutions, Egypt achieved longevity. Civilization did not depend on exceptional leadership alone, but on systems designed to endure. When dynasties fell, the framework remained, allowing renewal rather than collapse.
Egypt's economy was deeply connected to its environment. The Nile's predictable flooding shaped agricultural cycles and economic planning.
Unlike societies dependent on irregular rainfall, Egypt benefited from natural consistency. The state managed irrigation networks, ensuring equitable access to water. Grain storage protected against famine, reinforcing loyalty to authority. Redistribution during shortages reduced inequality and social unrest. Trade expanded cautiously. Egypt exchanged surplus goods with neighboring regions while maintaining self-sufficiency. This balance prevented dependency and protected stability. External contact enriched culture without undermining identity. Labor organization reflected moderation. Large projects relied on seasonal labor rather than permanent exploitation. Workers returned to farming when the flood season ended. This system preserved social cohesion. Economic restraint was valued. Excess accumulation was discouraged. Wealth was measured by stability rather than expansion. This moderation reduced conflict and supported long-term survival. Environmental understanding lay at the heart of Egyptian success. By aligning economic systems with natural cycles, Egypt minimized risk and maximized resilience. Balance rather than growth defined prosperity.
Egyptian culture emphasized continuity over change. Art, language, and ritual followed established forms. Symbols remained consistent across centuries, reinforcing shared identity. Writing preserved memory. Hieroglyphs recorded history, belief, and authority. Texts linked the present to the past, legitimizing rule and reinforcing tradition. Religion adapted without abandoning core principles. Access to the afterlife expanded, reflecting social change while preserving belief. This flexibility strengthened cohesion. Foreign influence tested identity, but Egypt absorbed rather than resisted. New rulers adopted Egyptian customs. Culture survived political transformation. Daily life reinforced continuity. Families passed skills and values across generations. Routine anchored society during upheaval. Ordinary people sustained civilization through consistent behavior. Adaptation allowed endurance. Egypt transformed gradually, integrating change without losing itself. This capacity distinguished it from civilizations that collapsed under pressure. Religion in ancient Egypt was not an isolated belief system, but the foundation upon which power, morality, and social order rested. It shaped how people understood the universe and their place within it. From the pharaoh to the farmer, life was lived with the awareness that human actions affected cosmic balance. At the center of this worldview was Ma'at, the principle of truth, balance, justice, and harmony. Ma'at was not merely an abstract idea, it was a guiding force that governed behavior, law, and leadership. The pharaoh was responsible for maintaining Ma'at on earth. Success or failure in this duty was believed to influence everything from harvests to national stability. Religion reinforced obedience not through fear alone, but through meaning. Egyptians believed that living in accordance with Ma'at ensured prosperity in life and favor in the afterlife. Moral behavior became a personal responsibility tied to cosmic consequence.
Temples served as the physical and symbolic heart of this system. They were spaces where gods were honored through daily rituals believed to sustain the universe. Priests performed these rituals not for spectacle, but as a duty essential to cosmic order. If rituals failed, balance could be disrupted. Over time, temples accumulated immense wealth and land. They employed thousands of workers and managed vast resources. This made the priesthood a powerful institution, sometimes rivaling royal authority. The relationship between pharaoh and priesthood required careful balance. Cooperation ensured stability. Rivalry threatened it. Despite its power, religion was adaptable. New gods rose in prominence, and older ones were reinterpreted. Foreign deities were sometimes integrated rather than rejected. This flexibility allowed Egyptian belief to remain relevant across centuries. Religion also shaped concepts of justice. Legal disputes were framed as moral imbalances requiring correction. Punishment aimed to restore harmony rather than impose suffering. Courts emphasized fairness, and corruption was seen as a violation of cosmic order. Through religion, ancient Egypt created a moral system that aligned personal behavior with collective survival. This alignment strengthened cohesion and reduced internal conflict. Belief was not enforced, it was lived.
Ancient Egypt is often remembered for its monuments rather than its wars. Military power played an important role in protecting stability. However, Egypt's approach to warfare differed from many other ancient states. Expansion was usually a response to threat, not ambition. For much of its history, Egypt relied on natural defenses. Deserts, seas, and distance limited invasion. This allowed Egypt to prioritize internal development over constant military engagement. When expansion did occur, it was often justified as restoring order beyond Egypt's borders. The new kingdom marked a shift toward a more active military policy. After experiencing foreign rule, Egypt pursued security through control of surrounding regions. Campaigns into Nubia and the Levant aimed to prevent future threats and secure resources. Yet, even at the height of empire, diplomacy remained central. Treaties, alliances, and marriage agreements reduced conflict. The famous peace treaty between Egypt and the Hittites illustrates this approach. Rather than endless war, balance of power was preferred. Military organization became more professional, but war was not glorified for its own sake. Victories were framed as restoration of Ma'at. Defeat, when it occurred, was often attributed to divine imbalance rather than strategic failure. Over time, maintaining empire became costly. Armies required resources, and distant territories were difficult to control. Internal pressures increased as military spending grew. This strain contributed to gradual decline. Egypt's experience demonstrates the limits of empire. Power could protect stability, but overextension threatened it. Ultimately, Egypt survived longest when restraint guided ambition.
Ancient Egypt did not end in a single moment of collapse. Its decline unfolded slowly, shaped by environmental, economic, and political pressures. Central authority weakened gradually, allowing local institutions to assume greater responsibility. Foreign rule marked transformation rather than erasure. New rulers governed Egypt, but they did so through existing structures. Language, religion, and daily life continued with remarkable consistency. This continuity softened the impact of political change.
As global trade networks expanded and new powers emerged, Egypt became part of larger systems. Independence was lost, but cultural identity remained strong. Egypt adapted to new realities without losing its past. Over time, religious change reshaped society. Christianity spread, and ancient temples fell silent. Yet belief did not disappear, it transformed. Many symbols and concepts persisted in new forms. Archaeology later revealed the depth of this continuity. Excavations uncovered cities, texts, and everyday objects that told stories beyond kings and monuments. These discoveries reframed Egypt as a complex society rather than a static mystery. Ancient Egypt's legacy lies not only in what it built, but in how it endured. It offers a model of civilization rooted in balance, adaptation, and patience. Its history challenges the idea that survival depends on constant expansion or innovation. Egypt reminds us that longevity is achieved through alignment between people, environment, belief, and institution. Through transformation rather than collapse, it continued to shape the world long after political power faded.
Ancient Egypt placed extraordinary value on the preservation of knowledge. Learning was not pursued as a path to innovation or disruption, but as a responsibility to maintain order across generations. Knowledge, like tradition, was something to be guarded, copied, and transmitted with care. Writing played a central role in this process. Hieroglyphs were more than a script. They were a sacred system that blended sound, image, and meaning. Words carved in stone or written on papyrus were believed to hold power beyond speech. To record something was to preserve it against time itself. Scribes occupied a respected position within society. Their training was long and disciplined, requiring years of memorization and copying. Accuracy mattered more than creativity. A mistake in a text was not simply an error, it was a disruption of continuity. Through this disciplined approach, Egyptian knowledge remained remarkably consistent over centuries. Education was limited to a small portion of the population, but its influence was wide. Administrative records, legal decisions, religious texts, and historical inscriptions shaped how society functioned. Written memory allowed Egypt to link present authority with past legitimacy. Scientific knowledge in Egypt was practical and observational. Medical texts recorded symptoms, treatments, and outcomes. Astronomy supported calendar systems essential for agriculture and ritual. Mathematics enabled construction, surveying, and taxation. These disciplines were not separated from religion or daily life. They existed to support balance and stability. Libraries and archives, particularly in later periods such as Ptolemaic Alexandria, expanded the reach of Egyptian learning. Greek and Egyptian traditions interacted, producing new forms of scholarship. Yet even in these cosmopolitan settings, respect for ancient authority remained strong. Knowledge in Egypt was cumulative rather than revolutionary. New ideas were integrated cautiously, framed as extensions of existing wisdom. This approach limited rapid transformation, but ensured reliability. In a civilization that valued endurance, certainty mattered more than novelty. Through learning, Egypt preserved not only information, but identity.
Knowledge became a bridge across time, allowing a civilization to remember itself long after political power shifted.
Art and architecture in ancient Egypt were expressions of permanence rather than personal expression. Their purpose was not to capture fleeting moments, but to communicate enduring truths about order, hierarchy, and balance. Egyptian art followed strict conventions. Figures were depicted according to symbolic importance rather than perspective. Size represented status. Composition emphasized clarity over realism. These rules ensured that meaning remained clear across generations. Art wasn't expected to innovate. Their role was to preserve visual language. By repeating established forms, art reinforced continuity and collective memory. Even during periods of political change, artistic conventions remained stable. Architecture served a similar purpose. Temples and monuments were built not for immediate use alone, but for eternity. Stone replaced mud brick in sacred contexts, signaling permanence. Orientation, alignment, and proportion reflected cosmic order. Monumental construction required coordination, planning, and shared labor. These projects reinforced loyalty to the state and belief in divine order. Participation connected individuals to something larger than themselves. Tombs and funerary art revealed the depth of Egyptian belief in continuity beyond life. Images, texts, and objects were placed to ensure survival in the afterlife. Art became a tool of immortality. Even modest homes reflected symbolic thinking. Layouts followed practical needs while respecting tradition. Decoration, though simple, carried meaning. Through art and architecture, Egypt communicated its values without words. The landscape itself became a record of belief. Long after voices faded, stone and image continued to speak. This visual language influenced later cultures. Greek and Roman artists borrowed Egyptian symbols. Modern fascination continues because these works were designed to endure. Art in Egypt was not about change, it was about permanence. Through repetition and restraint, it created a civilization visually recognizable across millennia. Ancient Egypt occupies a unique place in world history. Its longevity challenges common assumptions about civilization, progress, and power. Rather than rising quickly and collapsing dramatically, Egypt endured through adaptation and restraint. Egypt demonstrates that stability can be a strength. By aligning institutions with environment, belief, and social structure, it minimized disruption. While other civilizations pursued expansion, Egypt often pursued balance. This approach shaped its interactions with the wider world. Egypt influenced neighbors through trade, diplomacy, and culture, rather than constant conquest. Its ideas traveled quietly, embedded in later traditions. Even after political independence ended, Egypt continued to matter. As a Roman province, it fed empires. As a center of learning, it shaped scholarship. As a cultural memory, it inspired fascination. Egypt's endurance also reveals limits. Resistance to rapid change sometimes delayed adaptation. External pressures eventually reshaped society. Yet transformation occurred gradually, preserving identity rather than erasing it. Modern study has reframed Egypt not as a static mystery, but as a dynamic society responding thoughtfully to its circumstances. Archaeology reveals complexity, diversity, and human experience beyond monuments. The story of Egypt invites reflection. It suggests that longevity arises from balance between innovation and tradition, authority and responsibility, change and continuity. In a world defined by speed, Egypt offers a different model, one rooted in patience and preservation. Its history reminds us that civilizations do not endure by accident, they endure by choice. Through thousands of years, Egypt chose balance. That choice shaped a legacy still visible today.
Ancient Egypt's long survival was deeply connected to how it understood and managed risk. While the Nile offered predictability, it also carried uncertainty. Floods could be too low or too high, threatening harvests and livelihoods. Egypt's response to this uncertainty reveals much about its resilience. Rather than attempting to control nature completely, Egyptians worked with natural cycles. Agricultural planning aligned with seasonal rhythms. Irrigation systems were designed to distribute water gradually, reducing the impact of extreme variation. Storage facilities ensured surplus could be preserved for lean years. This environmental awareness extended to governance. The state monitored agricultural output and adjusted taxation accordingly. In years of abundance, surplus was collected. In years of scarcity, redistribution prevented widespread famine. This flexible approach reduced social tension and reinforced trust in authority. Risk management also influenced settlement patterns. Communities clustered along the Nile but avoided unnecessary expansion into unstable terrain. Deserts served as buffers rather than frontiers to conquer. This cautious spatial organization minimized exposure to environmental threat. Religious belief reinforced acceptance of uncertainty. Variations in flood levels were interpreted through divine frameworks rather than blamed solely on leadership. Rituals sought to restore balance rather than assign fault. This belief system reduced panic and maintained cohesion during hardship. Egypt's approach contrasts sharply with societies that collapsed under environmental stress. By integrating planning, belief, and administration, Egypt transformed uncertainty into manageable risk. Survival depended not on eliminating danger, but on absorbing it.
Through this strategy, Egypt weathered droughts, shifts in climate, and demographic change. Environmental resilience became cultural resilience, shaping a civilization that endured through patience rather than force. Ethics in ancient Egypt were not codified through strict moral laws, but embedded in social expectation. The principle of Ma'at guided behavior across all levels of society. Ethics were practical, relational, and deeply tied to communal survival. Individuals were expected to act responsibly within their roles. Farmers tended fields, officials administered fairly, priests maintained ritual order. Moral failure was understood as disruption of balance rather than personal sin alone. This framing emphasized responsibility over punishment. Texts such as wisdom literature offered guidance on conduct. These writings encouraged moderation, honesty, and restraint. They warned against arrogance and exploitation. Ethical behavior was linked to long-term stability rather than immediate reward. Community life reinforced these values. Cooperation was essential for agriculture, construction, and ritual. Shared labor created shared responsibility. Social bonds reduced conflict and fostered mutual reliance. Leadership ethics mattered greatly. Officials were judged by their ability to preserve harmony. Abuse of power threatened legitimacy. Corruption was not merely illegal, it was morally dangerous. Even wealth carried ethical obligation. Prosperity was to be used responsibly, not displayed excessively. Redistribution during shortages reinforced social trust. These ethical structures reduced inequality and rebellion. By aligning personal behavior with collective survival, Egypt maintained internal cohesion across centuries. Ethics were not solely enforced from above, they were sustained through shared belief and daily practice.
Ancient Egyptians understood history as a living presence rather than a distant record. Memory shaped identity, authority, and meaning. Recording the past was an act of preservation and power. Royal inscriptions emphasized continuity. Rulers portrayed themselves as restorers of order, linking reigns to legendary predecessors. This narrative reinforced legitimacy and stability. History was not presented as change, but as renewal. Monuments served as memory devices. Temples, tombs, and statues recorded names and deeds. To be named was to exist beyond death. Memory became a form of immortality. Historical writing prioritized moral meaning over chronology. Events were framed to demonstrate balance restored or order maintained. Failure was rarely emphasized, continuity was. This selective memory strengthened identity. By emphasizing endurance, Egypt reinforced belief in stability. Even periods of crisis were absorbed into a larger narrative of persistence. Later cultures inherited this memory. Greek and Roman writers viewed Egypt as ancient wisdom incarnate. Their accounts preserved fragments of Egyptian self-image, reshaped through external perspectives. Modern archaeology has expanded this narrative. Excavations reveal daily life, regional diversity, and change beneath official records. History becomes richer, more human. Yet the core remains. Egypt remembered itself as enduring. That memory shaped how it was governed, worshipped, and understood. History was not simply recorded, it was lived.
Ancient Egypt's economy was designed to sustain stability rather than maximize short-term growth. Production, labor, and distribution followed patterns aligned with environmental cycles and social ethics. This system minimized volatility and ensured continuity across generations. Agriculture formed the backbone of economic life. The Nile's flooding deposited fertile silt, allowing reliable crop yields. Farmers organized work according to seasonal rhythms, planting and harvesting in coordination with the river's cycle. This predictability reduced uncertainty and enabled long-term planning. Labor was mobilized through obligation rather than coercion. During flood seasons, when fields were submerged, workers contributed to state projects such as construction and maintenance. This seasonal rotation preserved livelihoods while supporting collective needs. Permanent exploitation was rare. Craft production complemented agriculture. Artisans produced tools, textiles, pottery, and luxury goods. Workshops often operated under temple or state supervision, ensuring quality and continuity. Skills were transmitted through apprenticeship, reinforcing reliability over experimentation. Distribution systems played a critical role. Grain storage facilities managed surplus and redistribution. In times of shortage, reserves were released to prevent famine. This practice strengthened trust in authority and reduced social unrest. Economic security reinforced political legitimacy. Trade expanded cautiously. Egypt exchanged surplus goods with neighboring regions while avoiding dependence. This controlled engagement preserved self-sufficiency. External goods supplemented rather than replaced local production. Taxation was flexible. Levies adjusted according to harvest quality, reflecting environmental conditions. This adaptability prevented excessive burden during poor years and reinforced social cohesion. Through moderation and organization, Egypt's economy prioritized endurance. Production served stability, not accumulation. This approach supported a civilization that valued balance over expansion. Language in ancient Egypt was both practical and symbolic. Communication reinforced identity, authority, and continuity. Writing, speech, and imagery worked together to sustain social order. Hieroglyphs combined sound, image, and meaning. This visual language conveyed authority and sacred power. Writing was not merely informational, it was performative. Inscribed words were believed to carry lasting presence. Administrative scripts facilitated governance. Records tracked resources, labor, and law. Consistency in language ensured continuity across administrations. Precision mattered more than style. Language also shaped identity. Titles, names, and formulaic expressions reinforced hierarchy and legitimacy. Rulers adopted traditional epithets to align themselves with the past. Continuity of language validated authority. Oral communication remained vital. Instruction, ritual, and community life relied on spoken tradition. Stories and teachings transmitted values across generations. Oral and written forms reinforced one another. Multilingual environments emerged during periods of foreign rule. Greek and later Latin coexisted with Egyptian dialects. Yet local identity persisted. Language adapted without disappearing. Communication bridged time. Texts preserved memory and belief. By controlling narrative, Egypt shaped how it understood itself. Language became a tool of endurance, maintaining coherence through transformation.
Ancient Egypt's survival depended on its capacity to integrate change without losing identity. Adaptation was gradual and selective. External influences were absorbed into existing frameworks. Foreign rulers adopted Egyptian customs to legitimize rule. Titles, rituals, and imagery connected them to tradition. This integration preserved continuity despite political change. Cultural practices adapted subtly. Religious forms evolved, incorporating new elements while preserving core beliefs. Art maintained symbolic conventions even as styles shifted. Continuity outweighed novelty. Local life remained resilient. Villages preserved routines of work, worship, and family life. These daily practices anchored society through upheaval. Stability emerged from repetition. Identity was maintained through shared memory. Rituals, festivals, and monuments reinforced belonging. Change was framed as restoration rather than rupture. This adaptive strategy prevented cultural collapse. Egypt transformed under new regimes, yet retained coherence. Its endurance illustrates how societies survive by aligning change with tradition. Through patience and integration, ancient Egypt persisted. Its legacy lies not only in monuments, but in the quiet strength of cultural continuity.
Ancient Egypt developed a form of governance uniquely suited to long-term stability. Authority was centralized, yet it functioned through layers of administration that distributed responsibility across society. This balance between central power and local management allowed Egypt to rule vast territories without constant upheaval. The pharaoh symbolized unity. As the living representative of divine order, the ruler embodied continuity between past, present, and future. However, daily governance relied on officials trained to implement established procedures. This separation between symbolic authority and practical administration prevented disruption when leadership changed.
Administrative divisions organized land, labor, and resources efficiently. Provinces were overseen by governors who managed taxation, irrigation, and local justice. Their authority was derived from tradition rather than innovation. Stability mattered more than personal ambition. Record-keeping was essential. Written accounts tracked harvests, labor obligations, and legal decisions. This documentation ensured consistency across generations. Governance became institutional memory rather than individual command. Public works reinforced legitimacy. Maintenance of canals, roads, and temples demonstrated the state's role as caretaker. These projects were not displays of excess, but acts of stewardship. Participation connected citizens to authority through shared effort. When central power weakened, local administration preserved order. Villages continued functioning even during dynastic transitions. This resilience allowed Egypt to recover from political fragmentation without cultural collapse. Governance in Egypt emphasized continuity over reform. Change occurred slowly, framed as restoration. Through restraint and institutional strength, Egypt achieved longevity rare in the ancient world.
Belief in the afterlife shaped nearly every aspect of ancient Egyptian life. Death was not an end, but a transition within an eternal cycle. This conviction influenced ethics, art, architecture, and daily behavior. Preparation for the afterlife began during life. Moral conduct was essential, as the soul would face judgment. The heart was weighed against the feather of Ma'at, symbolizing truth and balance. A life lived responsibly ensured passage into the eternal realm. Burial practices reflected social status but shared common principles. Bodies were preserved to maintain identity beyond death. Tombs contained objects needed for the next world: food, tools, texts, and images. Even modest burials followed these beliefs. Funerary texts guided the deceased. Spells and prayers protected the soul during its journey. Over time, these texts became more accessible, extending spiritual opportunity beyond royalty. This inclusivity strengthened belief across society. Tombs and mortuary temples reinforced memory. Names inscribed in stone ensured continued existence. To be remembered was to endure. This belief connected individual identity with communal history. Rituals for the dead involved the living. Offerings maintained bonds between generations. Ancestors remained part of family life, reinforcing continuity. Through belief in the afterlife, Egyptians found meaning beyond mortality. This perspective reduced fear of death and encouraged ethical living. The afterlife was not escape, but extension, a continuation of order beyond time. As ancient Egypt moved through later periods of foreign rule and cultural change, its identity transformed rather than vanished. Political authority shifted, yet foundational beliefs persisted. This adaptability ensured enduring influence. Under Greek and Roman rule, Egyptian traditions blended with new ideas. Alexandria became a center of learning where cultures intersected. Egyptian religious concepts influenced philosophical thought beyond its borders. Even as ancient temples fell silent, symbols endured. Architectural forms, myths, and administrative practices shaped later societies. Egypt's understanding of governance, law, and belief traveled through time. Modern rediscovery renewed fascination. Archaeology revealed complexity beneath myth. Scholars reconstructed daily life, economy, and thought. Egypt emerged not as static mystery, but as dynamic civilization. Its influence continues today. Concepts of state organization, environmental management, and moral order remain relevant. Egypt's history offers lessons about balance, patience, and resilience. Ancient Egypt's legacy lies not only in monuments, but in its model of endurance. It demonstrates how societies can persist through alignment between environment, belief, and institution. Through transformation rather than collapse, Egypt left a long shadow across history, one that still shapes understanding of civilization itself.
Ancient Egyptian society was hierarchical, yet its inequalities were moderated by shared belief and institutional responsibility. While status differences existed, extreme disparity was limited by moral expectation and communal obligation. Social order was not merely enforced, it was accepted as part of cosmic balance. Hierarchy began with the pharaoh and extended through priests, officials, craftsmen, farmers, and laborers. Each role was understood as necessary. Prestige brought responsibility, not unchecked privilege. Officials were expected to serve fairly, and abuse of authority threatened legitimacy. Wealth existed, but accumulation was restrained. Display beyond custom was discouraged. Prosperity carried ethical obligation, especially during times of scarcity. Redistribution of grain and labor protected the vulnerable, reinforcing social trust. Women occupied a notable position. They could own property, inherit wealth,
and engage in legal action. Marriage was contractual, but often affectionate. These rights contributed to social stability and family continuity. Slavery existed, primarily through war captives or debt, but it did not dominate the economy. Most labor was performed by free citizens under obligation. This distinction preserved social cohesion. Justice sought restoration rather than retribution. Courts emphasized fairness and context. Corruption was morally dangerous, not merely illegal. This ethical framing limited social fracture. Inequality in Egypt was real, but bounded. By aligning hierarchy with responsibility and belief, society maintained order without widespread unrest. Stability emerged from acceptance, reinforced by ethics and ritual.
Ancient Egypt was not a uniform landscape, but a collection of regions unified by the Nile. Geography shaped identity, administration, and belonging. Cities, villages, and temples formed networks of interaction rather than isolated centers. Urban centers developed around religious and administrative hubs. Cities such as Memphis, Thebes, and later Alexandria served as political and cultural anchors. Yet rural villages sustained daily life. The countryside mattered as much as the capital. Regional administration balanced unity with local autonomy. Governors managed resources and justice according to custom. Local identity coexisted with loyalty to the state. This balance reduced resistance and preserved cohesion. The Nile connected regions physically and symbolically. Transportation along the river enabled exchange of goods, people, and ideas. Shared dependence on the river fostered collective identity. Borders were understood as zones of interaction rather than rigid lines. Trade and diplomacy linked Egypt to Nubia, the Levant, and the Mediterranean. Cultural exchange occurred without dissolving identity. Sacred geography reinforced belonging. Temples marked landscapes with meaning. Pilgrimage and festival connected regions through ritual movement. Space became memory. By integrating geography with administration and belief, Egypt transformed landscape into identity. Place mattered, not as possession, but as shared foundation of civilization.
Ancient Egyptians understood survival not as resistance to change, but as mastery of it. Time was cyclical, and history was renewal rather than rupture. This worldview shaped how Egypt experienced transformation. Change occurred, but slowly. New dynasties framed rule as restoration. Innovations were absorbed into tradition. This pacing prevented social shock and preserved continuity. Crisis did not erase identity. Periods of fragmentation were followed by reorganization. Institutions adapted. Memory bridged disruption. Foreign rule challenged autonomy but not existence. Egypt became part of larger systems while maintaining cultural coherence. Transformation replaced collapse. Historical survival required patience. Decisions favored long-term balance over immediate gain. This restraint allowed endurance across millennia. Modern perspectives often equate progress with speed. Egypt offers a counterexample. Longevity emerged from moderation, alignment, and belief. In tracing Egypt's long survival, we see history as accumulation rather than replacement. Civilization endured because it learned to change without losing itself. Egypt's lesson is quiet but profound. Survival is not the absence of change, but the art of continuity within it. Family formed the fundamental unit of ancient Egyptian society. While the state, religion, and institutions provided structure, daily life unfolded within households bound by kinship, cooperation, and shared responsibility. Stability at the family level supported stability across the civilization. Marriage in Egypt was practical and contractual, yet often characterized by companionship rather than rigid hierarchy. Husbands and wives shared responsibilities according to custom. Household management was a central economic function, and women played an essential role in maintaining stability. Unlike many ancient societies, women could own property, inherit wealth, and represent themselves legally. These rights were not revolutionary, but they contributed to social balance. Children were valued as continuity of family and society. Education began at home, where skills and values were transmitted through observation. Literacy was rare, but moral instruction was widespread. Respect for elders reinforced intergenerational continuity. Extended families often lived together, sharing labor and resources. This arrangement provided resilience during hardship. Care for the young and elderly was a communal obligation, not solely an individual burden. Domestic life reflected moderation. Homes were simple, designed for practicality rather than display. Food preparation, textile production, and tool maintenance occurred within households. These activities anchored daily routine and reinforced cooperation. Family rituals connected life stages of birth, marriage, death to broader belief systems. Domestic worship honored household gods and ancestors, linking private life to cosmic order. Through family life, Egyptians internalized values of balance, responsibility, and continuity. By sustaining stability at the most intimate level, family structures supported the endurance of Egyptian civilization across centuries. Ancient Egyptian medicine reflected a holistic understanding of health that combined observation, experience, and belief. Illness was viewed not solely as physical dysfunction, but as imbalance within the body or disruption of cosmic order. Medical practitioners treated injuries, infections, and chronic conditions using practical methods. Texts recorded symptoms, diagnoses, and treatments, demonstrating empirical knowledge. Remedies included herbal preparations, surgical procedures, and hygiene practices. At the same time, spiritual elements played a role. Healing rituals, prayers, and protective charms complemented physical treatment. This integrated approach addressed both body and mind, reinforcing belief in balance. Physicians were respected specialists, often associated with temples. Training emphasized careful observation and tradition rather than experimentation. Successful methods were preserved and transmitted across generations. Public health practices supported overall well-being. Cleanliness was valued, particularly in food preparation and ritual contexts. Awareness of sanitation reduced disease spread. Injury from labor or conflict was common, and medical knowledge addressed practical needs. Bone setting, wound care, and pain management reflected advanced understanding for the period. Health was a shared concern. Caring for the sick reinforced communal responsibility. Through medicine, Egypt demonstrated how practical knowledge and belief could combine to sustain human life within a balanced society. Aging in ancient Egypt carried respect rather than marginalization. Elders embodied memory, experience, and continuity. Their presence linked past and present, reinforcing cultural stability. Older individuals often held advisory roles within families and communities. Experience conferred authority. Knowledge accumulated over time guided decision-making and preserved tradition. Care for the elderly was a familial obligation. Extended households ensured support. This interdependence strengthened social bonds and reduced isolation. Memory extended beyond living generations. Ancestor veneration maintained relationships between the living and the dead. Offerings and rituals reinforced continuity across time. Tombs and inscriptions preserved names and identities. To be remembered was to endure beyond physical life. Memory functioned as social immortality. Historical memory also mattered. Communities remembered events, rulers, and traditions through storytelling and ritual. This collective memory shaped identity. By honoring age and memory, Egyptian society reinforced patience and long-term perspective. Continuity depended not on youth or innovation alone, but on accumulated experience. Through respect for aging and remembrance, Egypt sustained itself across millennia. Ancient Egyptian civilization rested not only on institutions and belief, but on the everyday cooperation of its people. While kings, temples, and administrators shaped large structures, it was community life that sustained stability across generations. Villages functioned as tightly connected units. Most Egyptians lived in small settlements along the Nile, where cooperation was essential for survival. Agricultural work required coordination. Fields were planted and harvested collectively, irrigation systems maintained jointly, and storage shared during times of scarcity. Community leaders played a mediating role. They resolved disputes, organized labor, and represented local concerns to higher authorities. Their legitimacy came not from force, but from trust and familiarity. This localized governance reduced conflict and prevented small tensions from escalating. Mutual responsibility defined social relations. Families relied on neighbors for assistance during illness, childbirth, or harvest failure. Reciprocity created informal safety nets that complemented state redistribution. In this way, social cohesion extended beyond official systems. Festivals and rituals reinforced communal bonds. Religious celebrations brought villages together, reaffirming shared identity and belief. Music, food, and ritual performance strengthened emotional connection and collective memory. These moments of unity mattered as much as formal governance. Work itself reinforced cooperation. Large projects such as canal maintenance or construction were communal efforts. Participation was expected, but it also fostered pride and belonging. People saw themselves as contributors to something larger than individual survival. Conflict existed, but it was moderated by social expectation. Public shame, loss of reputation, and moral disapproval discouraged antisocial behavior. Order was maintained as much through community pressure as through law. This emphasis on cooperation explains Egypt's resilience during political change. Even when central authority weakened, villages continued functioning. Daily life did not collapse with dynasties. Civilization endured because its foundation rested on people working together. Community life anchored Egyptian identity. It translated abstract beliefs into lived experience. Through cooperation, Egyptians transformed stability from an idea into a daily practice, one repeated across centuries. Ancient Egyptian society experienced time not merely as passing days, but as a rhythm structured by ritual and festival. These recurring moments shaped collective memory, reinforced belief, and synchronized individual lives with cosmic order. Ritual was not confined to temples. It permeated villages, households, and seasons. Festivals marked transitions of the year, of agricultural cycles, and of divine presence. They created shared experiences that bound communities together. During these occasions, ordinary routines paused. Work slowed, offerings increased, and public spaces filled with processions, music, and communal meals. Such pauses were essential. They reaffirmed belonging and reminded individuals that life extended beyond daily labor. Agricultural rituals aligned with the Nile cycle. The flood, planting, and harvest were each acknowledged through ceremonies seeking balance and abundance. These rituals expressed gratitude and anticipation rather than control. Egyptians did not attempt to dominate nature, they sought harmony with it. Through repetition, ritual transformed uncertainty into expectation. Temple festivals connected local communities to national identity. Processions carried sacred images beyond temple walls, allowing the divine to move among the people. This movement symbolized reciprocity. Gods protected the land, and the people honored the gods. Participation reinforced loyalty without coercion. Domestic ritual mattered equally. Households maintained small shrines, offered food to household deities, and honored ancestors. These acts linked private life to cosmic order. Children learned values not through instruction alone, but through participation. Ritual became education. Music and performance played a central role. Songs, rhythms, and dance accompany festivals, creating emotional resonance. These elements communicated meaning beyond words. Joy, reverence, and unity were experienced collectively. Emotion was not excess, it was structured expression. Ritual also regulated social behavior. Public ceremonies reinforced hierarchy and responsibility. Officials displayed generosity, priests demonstrated devotion, and community leaders affirmed duty. Visibility mattered. Order was seen, heard, and felt. Over time, repetition created continuity. Even as rulers changed, festivals endured. Names altered, forms adapted, but structure remained. Ritual absorbed change without breaking rhythm. This capacity to adapt while repeating explains endurance. Ritual time complemented administrative time. While records measured harvests and taxes, ritual measured meaning. Together, they created a complete social calendar, one practical, one symbolic. Balance emerged from their interaction. In periods of uncertainty, ritual intensified. Offerings increased, prayers multiplied, and festivals took on greater urgency. These responses stabilized emotion and reduced panic. Ritual acted as collective reassurance. Ancient Egypt's relationship with time was therefore not linear acceleration, but cyclical reassurance. By returning again and again to familiar ceremonies, society renewed itself. The future was faced through repetition, not rupture. Through ritual and festival, Egyptians lived history daily. Time became meaningful not by novelty, but by return. Stability was not static, it was rehearsed. And through rehearsal, civilization endured. Ancient Egyptian civilization was sustained not only by institutions and rituals, but by an internal moral framework that shaped how individuals understood themselves within society. This inner life, formed by belief, expectation, and shared values, created a powerful foundation for social stability. At the heart of this framework was the conviction that individual behavior mattered beyond immediate consequence. Actions were believed to echo across time, influencing both the social world and the cosmic order. Egyptians did not separate morality from daily life. Ethics were not abstract rules but practical guides for living in balance. The concept of Ma'at provided this guidance. Ma'at represented truth, justice, harmony, and right conduct. It was not enforced solely through law or punishment. Instead, it functioned as an internal compass. Individuals were encouraged to act honestly, moderately, and responsibly because imbalance threatened both personal fate and collective well-being. Moral instruction appeared in wisdom literature, texts offering advice on speech, behavior, and relationships. These writings emphasized restraint, humility, and respect. They warned against arrogance, greed, and abuse of power. Success was defined not by domination, but by harmony with others. Self-control was a valued trait. Excessive emotion, violence, or ambition were seen as dangerous disruptions. Calm behavior reflected inner balance. This expectation influenced social interaction, leadership, and even artistic expression. Order was not only external, it was internalized. Belief in judgment after death reinforced moral responsibility. Egyptians believed that the heart would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at. This imagery symbolized accountability. A life lived without balance risked eternal consequence. Moral behavior therefore extended beyond social reputation into spiritual destiny. Importantly, morality applied to all levels of society. Officials were expected to act fairly. Leaders were judged by their ability to protect the vulnerable. Even the powerful were subject to moral expectation. Abuse of authority was seen as a violation of cosmic order. Community life reinforced these values. Reputation mattered. Trust was essential. Social relationships depended on reliability and fairness. Moral failure carried social consequence, loss of honor, trust, and standing. Education reinforced internal discipline. Children learned values through observation rather than formal instruction. Behavior modeled by elders shaped expectation. Ethics were lived, not merely taught. This internal moral system reduced the need for constant enforcement. Social order relied on shared belief rather than fear alone. People governed themselves according to collective understanding. During times of crisis, moral frameworks provided stability. Rather than descending into chaos, communities sought restoration of balance. Responsibility replaced blame. Adaptation replaced panic. Ancient Egypt's endurance was therefore psychological as well as institutional. By aligning inner life with outer structure, society minimized fracture. Stability emerged not only from law or ritual, but from shared moral consciousness. Through belief and morality, Egyptians created a civilization capable of surviving immense spans of time. Balance was not imposed, it was chosen daily. And through that choice, continuity was preserved. Power in ancient Egypt functioned less through constant force and more through acceptance, habit, and shared expectation. Authority was visible, yet its effectiveness depended on consent shaped by belief and routine. This quiet mechanics of power explains how Egypt governed for centuries with relatively limited coercion. Obedience was not blind submission. It was framed as participation in order. The pharaoh represented divine balance, but authority extended through layers of administration that interacted daily with ordinary people. Officials collected grain, resolved disputes, and organized labor. Their presence was familiar rather than distant. Governance felt continuous, not intrusive. Ritual reinforced authority. Public ceremonies displayed generosity, justice, and devotion. Leaders were seen fulfilling duties rather than exercising dominance. Visibility mattered. Power that performed responsibility earned legitimacy. This performance reduced the need for enforcement. Documentation played a subtle role. Records of harvests, taxes, and labor obligations created predictability. When rules are known and consistent, compliance increases. Egypt's bureaucracy prioritized regularity over innovation, ensuring expectations were stable across time. Local leadership mattered deeply. Village elders informed and mediated between state and community. Their authority came from trust, not rank alone. Because decisions were contextual and personal, obedience felt reasonable. This mediation prevented small grievances from becoming systemic challenges. Punishment existed, but it was not the primary tool of control. Social pressure, reputation, and moral expectation regulated behavior. Public shame and loss of trust were powerful deterrents. Authority relied on internalized norms rather than constant surveillance. Religion intertwined with governance. Disobedience was framed as imbalance, not rebellion. This framing discouraged confrontation. People sought restoration rather than resistance. Conflict was absorbed through ritual and negotiation. Even during periods of weak central power, these mechanisms endured. Villages continued functioning. Officials adapted roles. Authority shifted, but order remained. This resilience reveals that Egypt's power structure was embedded in society itself. Foreign rulers understood this dynamic. To govern Egypt effectively, they adopted local titles, rituals, and administrative forms. Power required cultural alignment. Authority without acceptance proved fragile. The quiet mechanics of power, routine, ritual, mediation, and belief enabled long rule without constant violence. Stability emerged from familiarity. Change was gradual because authority was woven into daily life. In understanding Egyptian power, we see a model of governance rooted in continuity. Authority endured not by force alone, but by aligning expectation, belief, and practice. Power was sustained because it felt normal, necessary, and meaningful. In ancient Egypt, Work was not viewed merely as a means of survival. It was understood as a form of duty that connected individuals to society, the state, and the cosmic order. Labor carried moral meaning. To work was to participate in balance. Most Egyptians were engaged in agriculture or crafts. Their tasks followed seasonal rhythms shaped by the Nile. These rhythms gave structure to life. Planting, harvesting, building, and repairing were expected stages rather than burdens imposed unexpectedly. Predictability reduced anxiety and encouraged cooperation. Work obligations were shared. Large projects relied on collective labor rather than permanent exploitation. During flood seasons, when fields lay underwater, people contributed to state projects such as canal maintenance or construction. This rotation allowed individuals to serve the collective without abandoning personal livelihoods. Participation reinforced belonging. Individuals saw themselves as contributors to continuity rather than isolated workers. Even monumental projects were understood as communal achievements rather than symbols of oppression. Pride came from participation, not resistance. Skill and reliability mattered. Craftsmen, builders, and artisans followed established techniques. Accuracy was valued over experimentation. Through repetition, skills improved gradually. Knowledge was preserved rather than replaced. Work relationships reinforced ethics. Supervisors were expected to act fairly. Excessive cruelty or exploitation disrupted balance and threatened legitimacy. Responsibility flowed both upward and downward. Authority carried obligation. Payment and reward were practical. Workers received food, clothing, and shelter rather than abstract wages. This system linked labor directly to survival. Excess accumulation was discouraged. Contribution, not wealth, defined status. Work also structured time. Days were divided by task rather than clock. Progress was measured by completion rather than speed. This approach reduced pressure and supported endurance. Even leisure was understood in relation to work. Festivals and rest followed periods of labor. Balance mattered. Exhaustion threatened order as much as idleness. Through work, Egyptians experienced purpose. Daily effort connected them to ancestors who had worked the same land and to descendants who would continue. Labor became continuity in action. This understanding of work reduced alienation. People belonged to systems larger than themselves, yet those systems depended on individual contribution. Responsibility was mutual. When political power shifted, work patterns persisted. Fields were planted, tools repaired, and goods produced. Life continued. This continuity explains why Egyptian civilization endured beyond dynasties. Work was therefore not simply economic. It was moral, social, and symbolic. Through shared duty, ancient Egypt transformed labor into stability and stability into longevity. Education in ancient Egypt was not designed to encourage innovation or debate in the modern sense. Its primary purpose was preservation. Knowledge existed to maintain order, continuity, and reliability across generations. Learning was therefore disciplined, selective, and deeply connected to social responsibility. Formal education was limited to a small portion of the population, primarily those destined to become scribes, administrators, or priests. This limitation was intentional. Knowledge carried power, and power required restraint. By restricting access, Egypt ensured that learning remained consistent and controlled. Training began early. Young students memorized texts, copied symbols, and practiced writing repeatedly. Accuracy mattered more than originality. A student's success was measured by faithfulness to established forms rather than personal interpretation. This discipline protected institutional memory. Scribes formed the backbone of administration. They recorded harvests, labor obligations, legal decisions, and ritual texts. Their work ensured that governance remained predictable. Written records replaced arbitrary command. In this way, education stabilized authority. Religious education reinforced moral values. Priests learned rituals, hymns, and sacred narratives through repetition. Each word and gesture carried meaning. Deviation risked imbalance. Through ritual training, belief was preserved with precision. Wisdom literature played a central role in moral instruction. These texts offered advice on behavior, speech, and leadership. They emphasized humility, patience, and restraint. Success was framed as balance, not dominance. Failure came from excess. Education was not separate from daily life. Children learned skills by observing adults. Farming techniques, craft methods, and household management were passed informally. Learning occurred through participation rather than abstraction. Memory was sacred. Forgetting was dangerous. To forget rituals, procedures, or stories risked disorder. As a result, repetition was valued. Festivals, prayers, and daily routines reinforced learning continuously. This emphasis on memory created stability. Knowledge did not depend on individual brilliance. It depended on collective remembrance. Systems survived because they were rehearsed daily. Even during political change, education preserved identity. Foreign rulers adopted Egyptian administrative and religious training to govern effectively. Learning became a means of cultural survival. In modern terms, Egyptian education may appear conservative. Yet this conservatism enabled longevity. By prioritizing reliability over novelty, Egypt protected its foundations. Education was therefore an act of stewardship. Each generation received knowledge not to transform it, but to guard it. Through discipline, learning, and memory, ancient Egypt sustained itself across millennia. In ancient Egypt, law was not a rigid system of written codes, but a living practice guided by moral principle. Justice existed to restore balance rather than to impose punishment for its own sake. This approach reflected a broader worldview in which harmony mattered more than control. Legal authority flowed from the concept of ma'at. Judges, officials, and administrators were expected to act as guardians of balance. Their role was not merely to enforce rules, but to interpret situations wisely. Context mattered. Circumstances were considered. Justice was flexible rather than mechanical. Courts operated at local and regional levels. Disputes over land, labor, inheritance, or wrongdoing were resolved through testimony and judgment. Written records documented outcomes, ensuring continuity and precedent. However, decisions were shaped by fairness rather than strict legality. Oaths played an important role. Swearing truth before gods reinforced honesty. False testimony was not only a legal offense but a moral violation. The fear of imbalance discouraged deception. Law relied on conscience as much as coercion. Punishment existed, but it was measured. Fines, labor obligations, and social sanction were common. Severe penalties were reserved for serious offenses that threatened order. Public humiliation carried weight. Reputation mattered deeply in a society built on trust. Corruption was viewed as dangerous. Officials who abused authority disrupted balance and threatened legitimacy. Moral texts warned against bribery and injustice. Leadership was judged by fairness, not power alone. Women and men could both appear in legal matters. Property rights were recognized. Contracts were respected. This inclusivity reinforced stability within families and communities. Justice extended beyond the living. Moral accountability was believed to continue after death. This belief reinforced ethical conduct during life. Law and belief reinforced one another. During times of political weakness, local justice systems maintained order. Villages resolved disputes even when central authority faltered. Law persisted because it was embedded in social practice. This approach to justice reduced rebellion. People felt heard rather than dominated. Restoration replaced retaliation. Balance replaced fear. Ancient Egypt's legal culture demonstrates that stability does not require harsh enforcement. It requires trust, moral alignment, and flexibility. By grounding justice in balance rather than punishment, Egypt sustained order across centuries. Ancient Egypt was never an isolated civilization. While it valued self-sufficiency and stability, it also participated in networks of trade and exchange that connected it to Africa, the Near East, and the Mediterranean world. These interactions expanded resources and ideas without dissolving identity. Trade followed natural routes. The Nile served as Egypt's primary internal highway, allowing goods to move efficiently between regions. Beyond Egypt, routes extended south into Nubia, east toward the Levant, and west across desert paths. These corridors enabled controlled interaction rather than uncontrolled exposure. Exports reflected Egypt's strengths. Grain, linen, papyrus, and crafted goods moved outward. Imports filled strategic gaps: timber from Lebanon, metals from Sinai, incense from Punt, gold from Nubia. Trade supplemented local production rather than replacing it. Exchange was often organized through the state and temples. Officials negotiated shipments, recorded transactions, and ensured quality. This oversight reduced volatility and protected stability. Trade was regulated, not speculative. Diplomacy accompanied commerce. Gifts between rulers reinforced alliances and reduced conflict. Luxury goods functioned as symbols of respect and balance. Exchange carried political meaning beyond material value. Foreign communities lived within Egypt, particularly during later periods. These groups adopted local customs while maintaining distinct identities. Integration occurred gradually. Egypt absorbed difference without losing cohesion. Trade also transmitted ideas. Technologies, artistic motifs, and religious concepts traveled alongside goods. Egypt selectively adopted what aligned with existing frameworks. Innovation was filtered through tradition. Periods of instability did not end exchange. Even when political power weakened, trade continued through local networks. Economic interaction proved resilient. Egypt's participation in a connected world reveals a civilization confident in itself. Openness did not threaten identity because boundaries were cultural as much as geographic. Stability allowed exchange without fear. By balancing self-sufficiency with connection, Egypt benefited from the wider world while remaining distinct. Trade became another mechanism of endurance, linking Egypt to others without dissolving its core. Ancient Egypt's economy functioned on principles fundamentally different from modern market systems. Value was not defined by rapid exchange, speculation, or accumulation, but by reliability, trust, and continuity. Economic activity existed to support social balance rather than individual profit. Trust formed the foundation of exchange. People relied on predictable systems rather than negotiation alone. Measures, weights, and records ensured consistency. When grain was stored, distributed, or exchanged, confidence mattered more than competition. This trust reduced conflict and encouraged cooperation. Money, as later societies understood it, played a limited role. Barter and standardized goods formed the basis of transaction. Grain, labor, and crafted items functioned as units of value. This grounded economy in tangible necessity rather than abstract wealth. Temples and state institutions stabilized economic life. They stored surplus, regulated distribution, and absorbed risk. During periods of scarcity, reserves were released to prevent famine. This intervention protected the vulnerable and preserved social order. Markets existed, but they were moderated. Exchange occurred within moral expectation. Exploitation was discouraged through social pressure and ethical teaching. Excess profit threatened balance and reputation. Economic behavior carried moral consequence. Labor reinforced economic trust. Obligations were clear. People contributed according to role and season. In return, the system provided security. This reciprocal relationship reduced alienation. Individuals belonged to an economy that depended on them. Economic records reinforced memory. Transactions were documented, preserving accountability. Written continuity reduced disputes and prevented arbitrary change. Stability emerged from predictability. Even during political decline, economic patterns persisted. Villages continued farming, crafting, and exchanging. Life did not halt with dynasties. The economy endured because it was embedded in daily routine rather than centralized control alone. Foreign influence introduced new goods and practices, but core principles remained. Egypt absorbed external elements without adopting speculative systems that threatened balance. Through moderation, trust, and institutional support, Egypt created an economy resilient to crisis. Stability was valued above growth. Long-term survival mattered more than immediate gain. This economic philosophy supported Egypt's extraordinary endurance. By aligning value with continuity, ancient Egypt transformed economy into a mechanism of survival rather than instability. Ancient Egypt's extraordinary longevity cannot be understood without examining how power and economic control were ethically framed. Unlike later empires that pursued expansion for accumulation, Egypt treated resources as elements to be managed carefully rather than exploited aggressively. Control existed, but it was restrained by moral expectation and long-term thinking. The state functioned as a steward of resources. Land, water, labor, and grain were monitored not to maximize profit, but to ensure continuity. Authority justified itself by maintaining balance. When floods were generous, surplus was stored. When floods failed, reserves were released. This cycle reinforced trust between population and leadership. Resource control was inseparable from legitimacy. A ruler who failed to manage scarcity risked moral failure, not merely administrative criticism. Economic mismanagement was seen as a sign of cosmic imbalance. Thus, economic policy was framed as moral responsibility. Temples played a parallel role. They were among the largest landholders and economic institutions in Egypt. Yet their wealth was not solely for accumulation. Temples funded rituals, employment, relief, and maintenance of infrastructure. Their economic power reinforced social stability rather than undermining it. This dual system, state and temple, created redundancy. If one weakened, the other could compensate. Such redundancy increased resilience. Egypt did not rely on a single point of control. Labor obligations were integrated into this ethical framework. Participation in public works was framed as contribution rather than exploitation. People expected to give labor during certain seasons, and in return, the system ensured survival. This reciprocity reduced resentment. Economic ethics extended to leadership behavior. Officials were warned against corruption, hoarding, and cruelty. Wisdom texts repeatedly emphasized restraint and fairness. Abuse of power threatened not only social order but spiritual consequence. Even taxation reflected moderation. Levies adjusted to environmental conditions. Excess burden during poor harvests was discouraged. Flexibility preserved loyalty. Foreign tribute during imperial phases followed similar principles. Resources flowed into Egypt, but expansion was justified as restoration of order rather than conquest for wealth. When costs outweighed benefit, withdrawal followed. Over centuries, this ethical approach to economy reduced cycles of rebellion. While inequality existed, it was bounded by expectation of responsibility. Wealth carried obligation. As global conditions shifted and new powers emerged, Egypt's restraint system struggled against more aggressive economic models. Yet even then, local patterns endured. Villages continued managing resources through custom and cooperation. Ancient Egypt demonstrates that economic power need not be extractive to be effective. By embedding control within moral expectation, Egypt transformed economy into a stabilizing force. This alignment between power, ethics, and resource management explains why Egypt endured when many wealthier or more aggressive states collapsed. Longevity was chosen through restraint. Ancient Egypt did not disappear in a moment of collapse. Instead, it slowly transformed, absorbing change while preserving memory. Political independence faded, dynasties ended, and religion shifted, yet the deeper patterns of Egyptian civilization continued long after power moved elsewhere. What ultimately defines Egypt is not conquest or wealth, but endurance. For thousands of years, Egyptians maintained balance between environment, belief, authority, and daily life. They valued continuity over speed, restraint over excess, and responsibility over ambition. These choices shaped a civilization that outlived its rulers, its gods, and even its language. Egypt teaches that stability is not accidental. It is cultivated through shared values, ethical governance, and cooperation at every level of society. Villages mattered as much as capitals. Families mattered as much as kings. Routine mattered as much as ritual. Civilization survived because ordinary life remained ordered even when extraordinary power changed hands. The monuments that remain temples, tombs, inscriptions are not merely symbols of greatness. They are expressions of patience. They were built to last, just as the society that created them was designed to endure. Stone replaced haste. Memory replaced novelty. In the modern world, Egypt is often viewed as distant and mysterious. Yet its lessons are deeply human. It shows that long survival depends not on constant expansion, but on balance. Not on domination, but on responsibility. Not on endless innovation, but on knowing what must be preserved. Ancient Egypt reminds us that civilizations are sustained not by a single moment of brilliance, but by countless daily choices made in favor of harmony. Through moderation, belief, and cooperation, Egypt chose continuity again and again. That choice is why its story still speaks today.